Well, good afternoon. It's quite a pleasure to be here, and thank you, President Schill, for that introduction. I've had a fantastic morning so far. I could not have asked for a better start to the day. I'm engaging with students, faculty, and so many others, and I look forward to the remainder of today and part of tomorrow to just be able to hear and share and learn more from each other. Happy to be here talking with you guys. I want to talk a little bit about culture and architecture. I've been in practicing architecture in the cultural space now for nearly 2 decades at this point, and for the most part, when we define culture, that has meant certain building typologies, which I'll talk about. Some are significant that I'll show you in the built environment that are built. Museums, libraries, cultural centers, entertainment venues, we all know them, churches and the like. But throughout our practice, there was a vision about 5 years ago to see if we can use culture and design as a lever to really make an impact in addressing in collaboration, and I'll stress that, you'll see that as I go through examples of my work, in collaboration with many, many partners and stakeholders to address issues of equity that have plagued, for the most part, many of our cities as they rapidly change, but many other areas that we share together. So I'll get started. We know that throughout history that really cultural facilities and destinations have really been the most kind of inspiring environments for many of us. And so it was important for us to define why in terms of practicing. If you're trying to look to change a practice model, such as architecture, it's important to craft the tenets that sort of gird that practice. So we practice around 9 core tenets that we developed about 6 years ago. Strengthening connections between people, extremely important. That notion of collecting, sharing, and preserving history. History is something that is, debated these days. So how we approach and display history is even important. Building community awareness and that allows people to have shared experiences together. Fostering memorable experiences. This is our Atlanta Beltline project that opened in Atlanta, Georgia. Embracing cultural identity, and I'll talk a little bit about this. Some of these images are background images of some of the examples I'm going to show you. The National Center for Civil and Human Rights, creating transformative experiences, celebrating memory, really important, and we'll talk about that. And nurturing knowledge creation, the constant thirst for knowledge. We are all, sort of connected to our devices. And also honoring unique assets. This is an image that you see from the National Center for Civil and Human Rights of the Martin Luther King Gallery. And when we opened this museum, this is the only place that has that collection of his papers. And even when we did the Smithsonian National Museum of African American History and Culture, we don't have that collection here. So understanding that, what are unique assets and identifying them. So what we discovered with many of these projects across the nation is that they've become iconic catalysts, and what makes them want to catalyze people to action, to share, to engage in difficult discussions and conversations. We noticed around many of our projects that the places around and in between these buildings are often just as important as the buildings. These are just photos taken over the last couple of years, anywhere from the March for Our Lives rally against gun violence last year, to the National Women's March a couple years ago. There's the Gay Pride March. There's so many things that creating places where people feel comfortable to come together is important. So I want to talk about discovery. So oftentimes as architects, historically, and even, as I was trained as an architect decades ago, and the way I practiced even decades ago, Oftentimes, it was about a relationship between architect as designer and person X or YZ as client and user groups and stakeholders. And that was how we defined that practice model. What we're discovering is that to create these environments that are rich, that sustain, meaning that they're used in ways after we as the designers leave that we probably could not have anticipated when we were designing. They remake themselves, and that are resilient. They withstand change, rapid change. They withstand different types of unrest and discord, and they sustain celebratory times, or they sustain those. So this notion of engaging community engagement and discovery moved from being something that was a checklist to something that became integral and more like a co-design process. It becomes a partnership. So I'm going to actually walk you through architecture projects, but not necessarily talking about the formal ideas and expression that you would expect from an architect. It's going to be from a people perspective. So you can see how we do two things. It's really all about storytelling. And for me, storytelling means two things. It involves history and context. And when you mine for that, and then look for ways to express that metaphorically in building form, it creates something that is extraordinarily meaningful to the communities. And a lot of times communities, because they're African American. This studies or lecture today is focused on African American communities, but we can apply this to many communities to heal those wounds and begin to repair. So I'm going to talk briefly. I'm going to walk you through quickly 5 building projects and then 5 sort of urban cultural landscape projects, so you can see how this kind of infusion of culture can be applied at different scales and through different typologies. The National Museum of African American History and Culture, and thank you, Dr. Schill, I appreciate your comments. It was a wonderful effort for me. 8 years full-time of my life on that project, so that's a pound of flesh for sure. But 100 years in the making. It took 100 years to get this museum on this mall, and it started with civil rights African American veterans asking for something to memorialize. So that's nothing compared to the effort the people before me. So how do you begin to tell a story? If you subscribe to the notion that architecture is about telling stories, well, this is a pretty broad story to tell. It's multiple people, named and unnamed. And so these images that are on the board, we won this project through an international design competition, and so it was quite the competition. But we actually started thinking about the story, and we met in DC. Our team, a collaboration of 4 architecture firms. We led that 4 architecture firms and multiple consultants met in Washington, D.C., and it was actually the Tuesday after the inauguration, the first inauguration of President Barack Obama as President of the United States. And so this was in 2009. And we start with images. What inspires us? So what you see there, even to your lower left, is an image that was taken somebody snapped just a couple days earlier on the National Mall with people celebrating that historic moment of the election of America's first African-American president. We bought images and were inspired by what people do when they celebrate, the gestures that they make. We were inspired by agrarian concepts such as farming and the porch that was used in many areas of the southeastern part of the United States. We were also inspired by light and modulating light and what that means to African Americans who often felt invisible underground. And then finally, the image to your far right, we knew that this was an African American story told through the American lens. That context was important. So bringing in the notion of West African sensibilities through a caryatid that you see on the right, and that's a form used in West African art and architecture, and we were intrigued by that notion of the crowning form on top of the head that serves as the capital. Also bringing in notions of little-known story from southern parts of the United States, areas like New Orleans, Charleston, the wonderful ironwork that you see in many of those cities. Much of that was done by African-American craftsmen, freed and enslaved. So we wanted to pull that story forward and think about a way to bring historical stories, but in a fresh, modern way, because we believe that design should really be of its place and of its time. It should not try to mimic. So abstracting those ideas in a way that, that is fresh and relevant today. And so using those notions of putting a filigree or a screen in a crown form and using that to modulate light throughout the building was extremely important. And understanding that this form of the corona, which acknowledges its location through being tipped at this exact angle as the capstone of the Washington Monument, that it's able to, it's different colors and different times of different types of light, whether it's natural light, artificial light, cloudy, sunny, and we thought that that was just exemplifies the different sort of aspects and variety of color and form that we all have. There was a notion of the porch that I mentioned earlier that we thought was important. And what was important about the porch to African Americans was how they used the porch as truly a living space that mediated between indoor and exterior. So, so that in the southern parts of the United States, the porch was an extremely important element. So our interpretation of an exaggerated notion of porch, coupled with water. Water is significant because that was a significant part of the transatlantic slave trade, using combination of still and moving water to represent turbulent and also still, quiet times was really, really important. So thinking about water again on the inside in a way that that is brought in vertically to refresh and cleanse was important. So the water story here was a significant driver for our design. And so this exaggerated porch that cantilevers, you know, about 180 feet, 60 feet deep, was our way of acknowledging these notions of crown and porch and light and bringing those together. So that's an example of something that's telling a huge story for many, many people. But oftentimes there are smaller stories that only involve a few people that are just as impactful. The International Civil Rights Center and Museum in Greensboro, North Carolina, started with something where the building itself is the artifact. This was the original Woolworths building, where in 1964, young students from North Carolina A&T University made a very, very important decision, which was important for 17, 18, 19-year-olds, to sit down at a lunch counter and demand to be served. And that's, you know, that sparked the precursor, as we know, the sit-in movement to the broader fight for civil rights in this country. And so beyond just looking at the building in terms of preservation, which we do, restoring characteristics and original character and preserving that history, there was a significant, the lunch counter itself being an artifact in that building, restoring the outside, all of those things were important to us as we looked at design, but what was most important was mining for those stories, because the building and the built environment will always be there, but what about the people that actually experienced and were alive in 1960 and the stories from the four gentlemen that experienced this? So the oral histories, capturing those oral histories, extraordinarily important. And it was important more so for us because when we opened the museum, this was the four gentlemen. And these folks, as you know, are no longer, you know, they're not alive today. So that becomes a critical part of capturing culture is talking to people and mining for that. walk you through the third project here. This is the Harvey B. Gantz Center for African American Arts and Culture. The reason why this project I wanted to point out is so important is because this community, by the way, I should mention, these projects always have a very long incubation period. So my clients are like my life. Everything is like 10 years. So if I ever work for you, you know, I'll be there with you, part of your family forever. But this particular client had been looking for a site for an African American cultural center that, you know, was sort of promised by the city. We looked at many, many sites with them, but what the city ended up offering is what you see there, a little strip of land called the AAC Site in Charlotte, North Carolina. And the image on the right shows you that this really wasn't a site. It was, by all intents and purposes, it wasn't a buildable site at first glance. It was only 40, 50 feet wide, 400 feet long. The proportions were not desirable, and it was actually just the access ramp. The truck service ramp went underneath that site to service the new what was then the Wachovia Tower, which is now Wells Fargo. So it was a remnant site. That's the best way to think of it. And our client was actually sort of offended originally that the city would offer such a site and not acknowledge the importance of African American history and culture. But, you know, we saw a bit of opportunity here because you can't deny the fact that this remnant site was located in the heart of the cultural district. So sometimes location matters. And so let's see what we can do here. And so mining again from those stories, we looked back, we knew that this was so important and it had to, the built expression had to imbue the history of what this was about. Nearby, a highway in Charlotte had destroyed a prominent neighborhood called Brooklyn Village. So we researched that and knew that one of the key things that was destroyed was the Meijer School. And it had this edifice that they called Jacob's Ladder, and that the children would, every year, this was the classic photograph, graduation photograph, of taking that photograph on Jacob's Ladder, and so many people had that photograph in their living room because many people went to this high school. So we thought about that and the notion of African American quilting and how that was also really key for the Underground Railroad. And so we thought about Jacob's Ladder, lifting the building up above this ramp in a ladder-like form, and doing a skin on the building that really brought together this notion of weaving and ladder, and also thinking about the building 360 degrees, although we knew the backside eventually was a zero lot line, it would probably have a development. We wanted to think of the building holistically and bringing those notions of weaving around. And this is actually one of my favorite pictures because it's taken from the highway that destroyed the Brooklyn Village neighborhood. And so you can see how the building just nestles in the backdrop of the city, but it has its own expression. The National Center for Civil and Human Rights is in Atlanta on the CocaCola Pemberton Plaza. So this was another story. This is about human rights worldwide, a large story. And so when we were thinking about that, we thought about spaces for action, creating places where people could come together and really, really feel comfortable and invited and inclusive. And so this notion of people interlocking arms and the gestures people make when they unite, when they come together, was pretty strong and powerful and moving for us. So we thought about this. This is a building in the green, right? It's a chance to be iconic because it's standing alone. So we thought about folding those two arms together with that space for action in the middle. Partnership with Larry Kirkland, artist that did a fantastic piece up front. But thinking about the diversity of people in terms of size, proportion, color, and doing a variegated facade that brings that diversity to life in kind of an expression that sits all to its own. So that's kind of a fourth example of how we thought about, expressing this in the built environment. This last example is on the boards right now. So this is, we're working on the expansion of the Motown Museum. Okay, this is another broad story because Motown indeed was the music that changed America by most accounts. Most of us know Motown. I don't think there's any people that are too young that don't know it, and if you're that young, you do know it because just about every music is inspired by Motown. But anyway, this story whittled down to the fact that how did Motown and that music come to be? How was it able to transcend racial bounds in a time where music was separated and it did not commingle between African American music and popular culture? Well, in our minds, there were 4 ingredients that came together, and without any of those 4 ingredients, Motown would not be. And that started with Berry Gordy, the founder and CEO of Motown, but it started before that with his family and that rigorous structure and family that he came up with. Of course, Berry Gordy, the man himself, was a second ingredient, who was, the family, again, was in Detroit, working on, many of them working for the Big Four, one of the Big Four auto manufacturers. So Berry Gordy was working on those assembly lines. And through the rhythm, the regular rhythm of the assembly lines, he conceived in his mind that he could create beats and create music, even though he'd never done it before. So the ingenuity of a single man. The third element is a city that provided massive opportunity and escape. It was part of the first migration of African Americans out of the South. And the fourth ingredient was Hitsville, a little house that Berry Gordy purchased on West Grand Boulevard. And he purchased that house because it had a detached garage that he believed that he could, he called it Studio A, and he believed that he could make hits out of there. So then he got in his car, drove around, and plucked people off the street. And most of those artists, Diana Ross, Smokey Robinson, they were just plucked right off the street. They were kids. They were 17, 18 years old. So Motown produced such an album, of music. We decided to look at first color mapping the top 100 hits and picking out the prevailing colors of those classic album covers that we used to have albums and CDs that used to line up on shelves that most of us have memories of. But also what resonated was a song that in its day was revolutionary, and even when you listen to it today, it's timeless, and that was Marvin Gaye's What's Going On. So we really thought about sound mapping the main refrain from What's Going On, and really positioning this expansion behind the historic Hitsville house, behind these record albums, but with a beat so that the music really is palpable. So the building moves, it has movement and it has a soul to it, and that you can kind of sense that, and as it stands behind the iconic house, it stands as something distinct and apart, but something alive and vibrant. So in thinking about, okay, that's a sampling of our built work from our portfolio, how can we think about what this has done for those people that experience those projects and those building typologies? Can this be done on a larger scale? And that is now where we currently exist over the past 5 or so years in an area of work that I call Remembrance Design. And this is really about preserving identity in community-oriented designs. And if we're going to make great spaces, sites, and cities, it's really, really important. We know that cities are changing fast. Urban areas, they're growing largely due to economic forces, we know. We know that mass gentrification is happening, at rapid scale. We know that that's oftentimes, for the most part, driven by economic forces. We know that cultural erasure is happening, again, for all cultures, and that our cities are at risk, really, of becoming unaffordable, lacking multi-generationalism. Even kids coming out of college with 2 and 3 degrees often can't afford to live in some areas, and so they have to remove themselves from the things that cities provide, the great things, the access to culture, the access to transportation. So in thinking about what makes a place compelling and rich, it's that they have to be rooted firmly in their context. And we cannot, as designers, think about running off and designing something really beautiful and well-crafted and giving it to communities and saying, voila, now I've blessed you with one of my designs, feel good about that, and now I'll move on to my next project. So coming up with this notion of that remembrance design is about the process of how you do it more so than the product. If you have a good process, the product will be revolutionary in our opinion. So it really is about finding people who have been historically removed, disinvited from the process of design and the creation and making of their own spaces in their own communities. So it's really about doing, if you do this, providing an environment that's inclusive and that has a culturally sustainable future. And oftentimes, these communities have experienced hurt. They have been, marginalized, pushed to the side, just given, land has been taken, and you'll see some examples of this. And so you oftentimes have to understand that you can reconcile with the past and plan for the future. Those two things have to occur at the same time. So a lot of this work involves deep visioning, but there are key aspects that should always be there. Number one, changing our practice model. You have to think about expanding collaborations and partnerships beyond what traditionally you were thinking about, and President Schill mentioned some of them, the partners, whether it's public artists, historians, anthropologists, politicians, you name it. In this practice model, we're partnering with people that we never would have thought would have a voice in architecture and design. Don't we just do that? It's about leveraging those urban cultural assets. I had the wonderful opportunity even to walk around campus just this morning and seeing things. I just went to maybe half a dozen places that are assets that represent the culture of the university. How do you leverage that? And so thinking about that, it's also about leading with culture to create inclusivity in these areas that are rapidly expanding, as I mentioned. And it's finally, you gotta look at all projects as opportunities to mend physical or social risks that have occurred in many, many places in America. So I'm gonna quickly walk you through 5 projects, and this is gonna go a bit fast because I picked these 5 because they're at various scales, because oftentimes people think you need a massive project like the National Museum of African American History and Culture. You don't. Sometimes you just need a small Woolworth store. And sometimes people think you need massive land areas, and sometimes you don't. So I'm going to walk you through these very quickly. The first one I call Remembering Sycamore Hill. I love this project. It's close to me in North Carolina. It's an hour and a half, less than 2 hours from where I live. And so this is a historic Greenville, North Carolina, right there that sits on the river. And so the beautiful thing is that the city was doing a major public interest project. They were doing a major public park, an amenity along the river here. But for a minute, they forgot about the history until they were reminded by very, very strong voices in the African American community that stood up. This community in its day was a vibrant African American community. You can see it there. But the hallmark of this community was this church, the Sycamore Hill Baptist Church, that really this neighborhood believed that every child in the neighborhood went to this church, and it offered structure and rigor. And when they did that, they all went on to sort of be wonderful contributors to their respective communities as they got forward. So what happened? Urban renewal. So we know that a lot of the work that I do now is really trying to mend rifts from poor policies that were enacted, and poor decision-making that was enacted under the guise of the precursor, which is redlining, then subsequent urban renewal, transit and infrastructure projects. So the whole community was wiped out, but the city, the community, the African-American community, rallied to keep the church. And in this one photograph, if you look close, you can actually see the road routes around the church. So they saved it. But later the church still fell to arson. And so the notion was, in this wonderful public space that the city was creating, they came to this little 1.1 acre, and the brakes were put on because the African community said, no, you're not. That was our church. You're not going to treat this and as if this history wasn't here and we never existed. And so we were brought in, and in deep engagement with this community, there were 3 areas that stood out. The community was very proud, that sense of pride. There was also a sense of spirituality. People talked about the music and the structure that I mentioned. And they also talked about, even people that didn't go to that church, people in the community, whether Caucasian, Latino, whatever, talked about standing outside of that church on a Sunday late morning and hearing the music that just came out. So that was really, really important. And finally, the history, the deep loss of the memories and the prominence that they felt that they had. And so we were thinking about this notion of really freedom within structure and music, that music provides and that communities provide. And the 22 founders, largely a lot of them were female of this church, and this notion that they used to go down to the river through these sycamore trees to perform baptism, so the way the land kind of drops off. And then looking at the physical, formal structure of the church itself and understanding that there were key areas in this church, along with key assets, such as the stained glass windows that were in there, were intentionally placed and located for a reason. So we researched all of that. Obviously, you can see these projects involve deep research. And what people experienced, gathering, rejoicing, reflection, looking at the emotions and the uses that were involved there, and sort of recreating in a more modern way how to memorialize this with using interpretive walls or exhibit designs or bringing back in the history so people know that, looking at the Sycamore Grove itself and how to bring nature in to recreate that, stepped walls and terraces. And so this project is actually under construction now, but our notion is to bring back this feeling of prominence, and our interpretation, this is coming up from that river where they did the baptisms back in their time, and looking at it and how you interpret that prominent element that used to be on the corner, bringing back in interpretations that tell the stories, panels that people can read of the founders and the people that helped build this place, and their memories, bringing back this notion of gathering, but in a way that's fresh and reflective. So that was 1 acre, right? All right, let's move to Vancouver. This is 5 acres. And so this was quite interesting because Vancouver is a really wonderful city to visit. But they were proud of their history as being one of the cities in America that had not sort of taken its highways and infrastructure and viaducts and run it through their city like in the Americas. And so that's true to some extent, except, again, if there was 1 acre, or there's 1 area, 5, called, that's the study area, the only area in the city that was multicultural. It had African Canadians, it had Indigenous First Nations people, it had Asian Canadians, and that's the city, when it put its Northeast Falls Creek Viaduct, the Georgia Viaduct, took the off-ramp right through that area and destroyed that area. So Vancouver, this is a fascinating case study, and we're watching where this goes, because this was the first time that a development plan in Canada included a chapter on reconciliation and cultural redress, and looking at creative ways such as land trust and the like, and the city actually apologized. And so these are things that in the United States we would be clutching our pearls to do. But Vancouver is very intentional on addressing this issue. So looking back historically at what how these people came to be there. It was a porter's town, so a lot of people worked on the railroad, which was important. Looking at the urban fabric, the tightness of it all, we love getting back to that small scale, these 25-foot lots that are rich in uses and development. There was built form that was largely organic, and not as formalized, but when you talk to those people, they said, but it was our home. We may not have had much, but we had each other, and that was what was important. And there was also very handsome, built forms that existed along that area. So this was all destroyed, but one of the things that people kept talking about over and over again were these power lines. They had memories of the alleys and the way these power lines ran up and down these alleys. So we thought that was something to think about. We came up with five prevailing design themes. I won't go through all of this, but just to give you a sense of what they wanted, that identity of a cultural center, that organic geometry. I love Vancouver, but it's just peppered with these needle-like glass towers, one after another. They look almost identical, and there's no feeling. They didn't feel like that type of space felt accessible to them, and what they were about. Passages and storytellings, and really a space for social connections was important. So we came up and developed a long narrative. The long and short of this narrative is that this notion of porches, passages, and thresholds, and these in-between spaces, and the way that this community used outdoor space was very, very important, and how important Hogans Alley was. It was a physical space. It ran the length of that area. And so we reimagined putting Hogans Alley back almost in its original alignment, in a more organic shape form, bringing back that regular scale, the 25-foot lots that they loved, looking at culturally themed public art. Public art is huge in all of this, dance and entertainment, local residents gathering. And so this is our rendition of that development that pulls in public art, pulls in artifacts such as the porter's car, a main cultural center, thinking about those power lines that I mentioned before and how the memory of that can be kind of brought back in, but in a way that's useful, that provides connections above this active street life that is, filled with pop-ups and organic markets and small businesses, and looking at it from the back end, again, bringing in significant public art, mural art, extraordinarily important, and that was 5 acres. 3 more to go. 17 acres, Brooklyn Village in Charlotte, North Carolina. I call this reshaping the core of a major American city. This was the same area where I just showed you the Gantt Center that had the Jacob's Ladder and weaving pattern. So here we are, a few years later, being brought in to tackle the entire second ward of a major city. So 17 acres, how do you do that? This is truly, it's hard to imagine this story because it was such an affluent, relatively speaking for those days, African-American neighborhood. They owned everything. They owned their own banks. There were so many churches in the area. And the Second Ward High School was the dominant thing in that area. And, it's it's quite interesting when I look that the urban renewal, it was just destroyed in 1960, 1968. It was redlined at first. It was redlined based on racial ranking, as we know, but this was the extent of the destruction. And so it's kind of interesting when I go to Charlotte. We have one of our studios, my studios in Charlotte, and you look at the homes that exist that were destroyed back then. Today, those homes are worth about $700,000. So if you can imagine if residents were allowed to hold on to that real estate, the wealth that was lost. It's not just the memories and neighborhood and connections, it's also the wealth. Well, we looked at historic rows, looking into that, connections, points of interest, and wanted to restore back Meijer's Passage, a passageway that connected these two areas off a central 2-acre park anchored by a cultural center that brings back in interpretation, memories of these stained glass structures, and memories of what the actual platting looked like in the streets at that time. Moving on, I got 2 more. I want to talk about restoring lost energy in Miami, Florida, and this gets up to 30 acres. The reason why this is important is that shows you what can happen when there's a single person that has a vision that's not a person of color. This actually happens to be a wealthy developer, coupled with a community redevelopment authority that they align themselves with the same values. You know, you think all developers are really after creating density, getting as much money, selling things as market rate, checking a box for affordable housing, and moving on. So let me tell you the history there and why this one's important. This is a study area, if anybody's familiar with Miami. This is high real estate in Miami. This is 30 acres in the heart of what would be a dream for any developer that's thinking about making money to develop. This was a study area in 1936. This is what happened. 2 things happened. So there was a grid of intact cities or intact blocks, but Interstate 395 and 95 tore right through the heart of it. Right in the heart. I mean, this square is the area. So it's like, not just on the periphery, let's just take out the heart of what was the only area in Miami that blacks could live. And even people that came to perform, major entertainers, could perform in other places, but had to live or hotel in Miami. So this was significant. The notion of bringing back, of recognizing that the African diaspora community was an essential element of building Miami. We wanted to bring back key historic themes, the Black history and culture, the Black businesses, the music and entertainment. So any prominent leader or leaders of the 20th century, including folks like Ella Fitzgerald, Louis Armstrong, Josephine Baker, B.B. King, Jackie Robinson, Muhammad Ali, this was where they all came in Miami. So this was important. So what were the themes that worked against it? It was urban renewal that led to, the redlining first led to disinvestment and decline, and then of course the interstates came through. There were some prominent landmarks that were lost. And I'm paused here to note that there was something that really resonated with us, which was Good Bread Alley. During its heyday, Overtown was a self-sustaining community, had a strong spirit of entrepreneurship. And what everybody remembered was Good Bread Alley. So this was where people in the community would bake bread and sell it out of the windows on the back of their house. So the whole area smelled like Good Bread Alley. So there was a prolific artist, Perkins+, who really did, when the area was going to decline, he actually took boarded up areas along these buildings and did a fantastic mural called Good Bread Alley. And he said, I want people to see this from the highway that destroyed this neighborhood. So thinking about Purvis Young and his artwork and how it represented the spirit of this community in spite of everything that was going on. We came up with, a written vision and about what these things, what the space needed to celebrate, including walkable communities, an authentically Black space, and enable development and local investment. So looking at key existing and planned assets, existing, and these are the Ward rooming homes. Some of these, the first millionaire in Miami, his home is still there. The Lyric Theater, there's so much that's still there. The Dorsey House, looking at a design framework that brings back these three major areas, the green being the neighborhood aspect, the blue being entertainment and nightlife, and the orange being the history and culture, and the purple being that center of energy. That was the heart of where everything happened that was lost. Looking at how you bring that back through arts and performance, landscape parklets, looking at greening the area again, which was important, and embedding in the concrete and the walks these notions of interpretive design, landscape design. Marcus Samuelson is bringing a Red Rooster there, so yay to Miami for getting the second Red Rooster in the United States, because the only other one is in Harlem in New York City. So looking at how you bring those in along with sculpture, taking care of these historic avenues, some images there, and bringing in art. Bringing back the murals. Wynwood should not be the only place that has these fantastic murals. And recognizing mural and street art and graffiti art, that's a real art, and bringing that out to bear in interpretive elements and markers. So in the end, the vision for this is, the director of the CIA said, when you fly over Miami, we'll know that we're a success if it looks very different from any other area around it. So our notion was to keep the scale low, organic, gritty, and so that it doesn't look like just maximizing money. So finally, I think I have time for the last one. Okay, last one. This is I'll flip through this. This is a major effort going on in South Los Angeles called Destination Crenshaw. This will be something that our client, when they hired us, said, we want this to rival on the West Coast what the National Museum of African American History and Culture is, not just on the East Coast, but let's have a balance. So we said, but with an outdoor museum, I don't think I've ever done anything like that. So what this is a community-inspired public art and streetscape design process. So this project, this will celebrate the world-class contributions of Black Los Angeles to modern-day culture and beyond, and also help revitalize the heart of that community. So much of what is produced and created out of that community is actually, sort of appropriated and sold. And you can go in West Hollywood and find something that costs a fortune that was created in South Los Angeles, and these communities do not realize the benefits of that. So this will be the first project of its kind in Los Angeles that will strategically use an iconic street name to anchor and provide context for public art and streetscape. So beyond thinking about all the things that South Los Angeles has contributed, it's beyond the entertainment, the car culture, Kwanzaa, Pentecostal movement, Tina Turner, Tom Bradley, and some other things that we know resonate today. Black Lives Matter. These are things that were birthed out of that community, and that's why it's called Destination Crenshaw. So why does this project even exist? It started with the infrastructure project, but in 2017, we're hearing that the city of LA is building a line, that's great, that will take you from LAX to the metro line. So in a few years, you'll be able to go land in LAX and get to the expo line. But in every area where they're running this blue line, when it came to a major commercial corridor or neighborhood, they either elevated the train above grade or dug and tunneled beneath except in this 1.3 mile of Crenshaw, they blew at grade right through this neighborhood. So the community was just in sort of disbelief, incredulous that this could happen. But everybody realized, let's take what's happening as an opportunity. And so, by the way, I failed to mention, the city didn't even plan to put a stop there. So it was just gonna, So the community rallied to get a stop there at Crenshaw and Slauson that you see in the yellow, in the orange color. And this represents pretty much the 1.3 mile. Deep, this is a partnership. This is beyond engagement. This is co-design with this community. There are so many issues, so many collaborations. Our clients are politicians, they're historians, they're public artists, they're illustrators, that it's just a massive effort. Through all of this, the 4 things that we wanted to come out with are mentioned above: catalyze growth, leveraging these assets, honoring this heritage, and really creating a unique experience to drive investment there. So, once again, yeah, this is a lot going on. You know, we've got architecture, landscape, interpretive design, the metro alone, dealing with that is a lot. And the public art, this is really a project about the art. So how do you unify all of these things and bring them in concert to something that can express the values of this community? Very hard. But the time I was reading a book by Dr. Mindy Thompson-Fullilove. She's a clinical psychiatrist, and her work really focuses on the ways social and environmental fractures affect the mental health of communities. So it's really all about multiple displacement. And by the way, she's a professor of urban policy and health. So it's really about, and some of the displacement is really overt if you go back over 400 years of history, but some of it is not. But in the end, it doesn't matter. It all has the same effect of uprooting and disruption of the emotional ecostructure. So thinking about looking at anywhere from the forced global slave migration to the first and second migration from south to north and then from south to west in the United States, and looking at how this community arrived at this place in the first place. So we'll see what the 2020 census has, but really you can see the dark is that, you know, that shrinking and modulating of the African American community to this area, and that Crenshaw strip is right really in that blue area that you see there. So when thinking about root shock and the beauty, as traumatic as root shock is, the beauty of this community is that they have found a way to thrive and survive and contribute to popular culture and not have this root shock. You can go, this is the only place really west of the Mississippi that has multiple generations of African Americans. You can say my great-grandma lives there. In other places, maybe Harlem, areas of maybe south side of Chicago, but not a lot of places that you can really say that they have really planted and thrived. So metaphorically, we thought of, we turned to this African savanna, and we thought of this grass called the giant star of the African diaspora. And what was significant about this grass is that it was used as bedding hay on slave ships from the Gulf Coast, from the Gold Coast, and so it really traced the exact path of the diaspora across the globe, and it thrived in these sort of inhospitable conditions. But the beauty of it is that today in this country, the grass is found on every continent in the world, but we know it as Bermuda grass in this country, and where it should have sort of died and not been transported here, it thrived, and it not only thrived, it reinvented itself, it defied classification, chronology. It's a rhizome. It has these more shallow, but interconnected, hard to uproot. Anybody that's into horticulture roots knows this, but it grows. You know, this community to us grows much like a rhizome, and it just grows and continues to create and spread. So this notion of growing where you're planted, encouraging this neighborhood to continue to thrive, we thought about it through 4 lenses around this 1.43 Boulevard. The first is improvisation, and this is acknowledging that resourcefulness is really a positive outcome of struggle, and that Black culture often thrives and continues to push boundaries, oftentimes due to limited access to resources. So this ability to be able to improvise was really, really important. Thinking about first, historical first, first person first, so many firsts that came out of this area. Thinking about dreams, what might be conceived, what is imaginary, and finally thinking about togetherness. And in that, this is the ability of a community to come together to celebrate, mourn, and resist. We're telling the story in this neighborhood through major art installations, small parklets, culture and entertainment. The voice of this is going to be unapologetically Black, bold and energetic, diverse and inclusive. This idea of metaphorically using the giant star grass as shade structures, using this notion of moving from south to north and south to west, and having the rhizome move in that direction, using banners and interpretive devices and shade structure. We collaborated with illustrators to bring and illustrate historic characters in a quintessentially Black LA aesthetic, using local illustrators to create branding and graphics to develop a unique pattern derived from that African American tradition of quilt making, and having that signature and branding occur along the boulevard. Looking at the stories, the main stories that we're telling, Soul Train, Black Lives Matter, Biddy Mason, in the epicenters, looking at embedding those stories in the rhizome pattern. By the way, this project has 10 of the major African American artists in the country, whose, some of them whose pieces are, I don't know, even 5 years ago might have been, certainly were less than $1 million, and today they're like, several $1 million, Mark Bradford, Candy Wiley, Carrie James Marshall, and that's just bringing in that level of artists to sort of culturally mark the space is very important. This is also a project about environmental equity. When the city brought the Space Shuttle Endeavour down, they wiped out every single tree. There's not a tree, single tree, not one, on that boulevard. So we're bringing back and reforesting with 822 trees, native. There will be beyond those 10 artists, over 100 2D and 3D other art opportunities punctuated throughout the site. Just to give you a quick notion of what it looks like at each of these boulevards. At Improvisation, there'll be a 120-foot sign, and we envision this being made out of steel, and sort of this notion of improvisation where you take everyday materials and kind of bend it and twist it to make something new. The notion was that this would be seen from an airplane and would mark the landscape, so that's very important. Looking at some of the parks, how we bring those shade structures in, merging with the public art, looking at dreams. There was a wall there, our Mighty Contribution wall, that is a historic asset. Anybody knows that South LA knows this wall. It's famous. And so really how we bring that and leverage that and elevate a platform across the street to be able to see that. And finally, the last one is togetherness. This was inspired by one of the community meetings where a woman held up a Sankofa and said, this is meaningful to me. So this notion of going back from, and looking back from where you came, going back and elevating people that you know to a higher place. And we took a form and bent it back around, providing an opportunity for community gathering up under it in Sankofa Park, an opportunity for public art, and the underside can be used as opportunity for artists looking back down the 1.3 mile boulevard, celebrating, opportunity for shading, and also looking back to the Vision Theater, historic sign, and on a clear day in LA, you often get those, you can see the Hollywood Hills signs. And finally, just the notion of, the triumph of elevating and being able to celebrate that together. So I leave you with this, about this project, that Dr. Fullilove said, that, it's investing time, money, and love that really makes these spaces matter and make them different. So thank you. Sorry, I think I might have gone a little bit over time.